Welcome to the Good Listening To show. Your Life and Times with me, Chris Grimes, continues with the lovely, prolific pants that is Dr. Phil Hammond, who's here, I'm very chuffed to say, because 5 days ago I rang him up and he even stopped his lawnmower to speak to me. What we're going to get on to is whether or not what type of lawnmower are we driving? Are we straddling something or are we ratcheting along a lawn?
It's a big old unit. I don't know what it is, but I sit on it, basically.
A big old unit. So we're straddling something pretty epic here. As sort of a,
yes.
So what type of field are we ploughing here?
I'm lucky to have some green space around me that occasionally needs a bit of pruning. So yes, that's lovely. I love my green space, but I do try to keep it in top nick. So I do occasionally mow and prune it.
Lovely. So nice that your bush is nicely trimmed, and topiary is the word of the day. Lovely. So yes, you're really welcome. It's lovely to see you. We've got history. I cut my teeth on medical role play while you were at the Department of Social Medicine in Bristol. I also Googled you for the lols before we started. You know what you are, but for those of us, the listeners, the listenership here on UK Health Radio and in the Good Listening To podcast, you're a doctor, a GP, a journalist, a campaigner, a health writer. You can speak seriously or humorously, usually both, about any health or lifestyle topic is one of the things you've been saying about yourself as well.
Well, I don't think I suspect somebody said that about me. My agent probably.
You have a very good agent. Also, I was watching some of your wonderful stand-up routine. These are your jokes, but one thing I really struck on was the fact that one of the great things you said about being a GP is you can stick your finger up somebody's bottom in about 30 seconds of meeting them, and they'll be grateful for it. So that's
It's a bit like being in the Young Conservatives, Chris.
Was how that joke went on. It's definitely worth watching.
It's a very old joke, that one. Should have been.
It's lovely. And you cut your teeth in. It was Struck Off and Die was one of your first double acts, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was the beginning, and it wasn't really a conscious move into a comedy career. It was more of a catharsis. Two angry junior doctors working 120 hours a week, wanting to tell the world how dangerous it was, stalking the wards, killing patients when you were tired, burning the notes, burying the x-rays, laughing it off in the mess. It was our personal therapy that we performed in a Masonic lodge at midnight at the Edinburgh Fringe, and Radio 4 came to record it, and for reasons known only to themselves, put it out at 6:30 before the Archers. And it got record complaints to the Broadcasting Standards Council, and they were delighted. They offered us a series. I was invited to the BBC Light Entertainment Christmas party in 1991, and I spotted Ian Hislop, followed him into the toilet and said, "Can I have a column in Private Eye?" which is how everything started.
And indeed, it continues to this day, because I know your new book, we are so on fire and hot off the press. It's coming out, right, I think, on August the 17th, isn't it?
Do I have a new book coming out? Yes, August
yes.
the 19th, I think it's coming out. Although actually it's in bookshops now. It's hot off the press. And it's, a collection of my columns on the pandemic for Private Eye. So nicely written in real time. So no space for hindsight and re-altering the facts. So not all of it's correct, but it was written honestly and openly in real time. So it's quite a good diary of the pandemic, I would say.
And you said it's got some rather splendid cartoons as well, just to give.
Yeah, that's what I love about Private Eye. It sort of suits my brain. When something difficult happens in the world, I like the combination of serious journalism, satire, and cartoons. Those sort of three ways of looking at the world seem to make sense to me. And they've done some brilliant ones for COVID. So yeah, that's also in the book. Only $9.99.
Lovely.
As
I love
Ian Hislop says, can I just say, Ian Hislop's my only celebrity endorsement, says better than a public inquiry and quicker and cheaper. So there you go.
He's still very witty. And I loved your career advice about just follow Ian Hislop into the toilet and ask him if you can have a column, if you have that particular experience.
Doesn't work for everyone, but it worked for me.
Well, bless you for that. And I love the fact, full circle, here we are many, many years on, because a bit of a throwback, that was presumably close to about 25, 30 years ago.
Yes.
And then you're still there at Private Eye, and this book is hot off the press. Congratulations to you.
Yeah, I mean, after the NHS, Private Eye has been my longest employer. So yeah, I'm very grateful. I'm quite loyal, actually. I enjoy just getting a job and sticking at it.
And by the way, I was on your website, and I love the fact, I was interviewed by you, and it's lovely to be able to return the favour when you were doing your BBC morning surgery show at BBC Radio Bristol. And I know that you say "as sacked by the BBC" on your homepage, which I thought was very good.
Well, that was slightly unfortunate. I mean, I decided, not really because of Brexit, just because I think my people of East Somerset deserved an alternative, that I might stand against Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's my MP, who's a lovely man, And we decided we'd stand against him. And I had this idea of forming the Intelligent Kindness Party, or IKIP. And a bit like Martin Bell all those years ago, I'd stand for one term only, sort of to unite all the parties so they could get enough collective votes to unseat him. And so I said this on Countdown, actually, and it was then that Radio Bristol said they'd have to stand me down because I would have an unfair advantage, as if Rees-Mogg has trouble getting on the radio and television. Anyway, as it stood, I couldn't get anyone to back me. I initially had thoughts that the Lib Dems and Labour and the Green Party might rally around a single candidate, and they weren't remotely interested. They preferred to split the vote between them and wave him back in.
And just
so I lost my job for no reason, but it was a very heroic stand, I felt.
Bless you. And then again, full circle, rather than being struck off and die, you didn't go off and die. You rise like a veritable phoenix, Dr. Phil Hammond, and that's what we like to see. And just while we've got Jacobs Rees-Mogg, I know you said a very witty line, which is slightly on the edge here, but you've said, I live but a condom's throw away from Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Interestingly, he's not a bad local MP in the sense that if you take a problem to him, he's got the money and resources to try and sort it out. And as many Conservative MPs are, he's very wealthy. And so he's, but I think we could do better in North East Somerset.
That's a lovely default you've just highlighted there, because you do say one of your absolute core values is you're a big fan of kindness and self-care. And I heard the kindness that you were projecting in the perspective towards Jacobs Rees-Mogg there.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you.
You're welcome. So welcome. And we have history too, by the way. I have played a hapless hypochondriac seconding you as the Oxford Union debate many, many years ago. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. And even earlier than that, when we first moved into our new house and I invited all the funny role players along, I have a video of you leading Oops Upside Your Head in my front room. So you were very disco fever in those days.
The Gap band Oops Upside Your Head. There is a video out there. How lovely to know that. And we need to see the video of you straddling your big farm-like beastie on your lawn as well. But again, thank you for stopping your lawnmower. And that now brings us beautifully to our beautifully manicured lawn, to the entrance of your clearing, Phil Hammond. I'm going to bounce you along the storytelling metaphors of your life and times with me, Chris Grimes, which is, and if you haven't been listening to the show, why not? But it's going to be the usual metaphors of the clearing, a tree, a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, some alchemy, some gold, a cheeky bit of Shakespeare, and a cake. And there'll be a deliberate invitation for you to go deep at all points, but also to talk about your COVID Casebook book, obviously, as we go through. So this is going to take place in the clearing, where all good questions come to get asked, I think you'll find, and all good stories come to get told. So Dr. Phil Hammond, what is a clearing like for you? Where do you go to get clutter-free, inspirational, and able to think, please?
I like it underwater, which sounds slightly peculiar, but I often feel most at peace when I'm sitting on the bottom of a pond somewhere. If I think about my favourite clearing of all time, I had in 1980 what is fashionably known as a gap year. And I'd started life in Australia. I'd moved to the UK when my dad died and gone through being fairly Wiltshire to going to a fairly posh school, and then returning to Australia for my gap year. And I remember in Kakadu National Park, which is a beautiful national park in Northern Territory, climbing up this amazing red stone structure to the very top and discovering a pool at the top of it, and being able to do somersaults underwater in the pool and looking out over Arnhem Land, which is a sacred Aboriginal site. So when I'm thinking about the most peaceful clearing I've ever experienced, it is that. These days, it's probably a bit hot for me. My burn time in the Australian sun's about 3 minutes, so I would need a big tree to settle under to shade me. But yeah, somewhere in a pond, somewhere on top of a rocky outcrop with a beautiful view would be my clearing.
I like that. Also, enjoyed the fact you said sitting at the bottom of a pond. One would normally expect some sort of, beautiful coral reef or something like that. But you just, I went murky and dark water when you said.
Well, pond. Anything. I like skinny dipping. My postman's not so keen, but I skinny dip most mornings. And just being at the bottom of a pool with no clothes on is very liberating, I find.
And that now rather beautifully invites me to join you, naked if I may, at the bottom of your pond with my tree in a sort of waiting for Godot-esque way. So are we going to position this pond at the bottom of your garden, or is it going to be in the aboriginal scape, mate, as we talked about?
I'm going to go Kakadu. I think Kakadu National Park is where I want my tree to be.
Lovely. And we're both naked at the bottom of a pond in the Kakadu, whatever it's called, park. And yes, so now we're going to shake your tree to see which storytelling apples fall out. Hurrah! So this is where you hopefully have done an extra bit of preparation where you're going to answer the questions: 4 things that have shaped you, 3 things that inspire you, 2 things that never fail to grab your attention, borrowed from the film Up, that's, oh, squirrels, you know, what never fails to distract you, whatever else is going on in your life, and then 1 quirky or unusual fact about you, Dr Phil Hammond, we couldn't possibly know until you tell us. So over to you to shake your rather soggy canopy, please.
I presume I do these in order? 4 things that have shaped me. I guess rather inevitably, my father's death shaped me, because I was born in the UK but brought up in Australia, and had he not died in 1969, I might still be in Australia and be a very different person and have a very different accent to the one I have at the moment. And it shaped me, I guess, because I had a very happy and charmed life up until the age of 7, and they generally say, show me the man at 7, boy at 7, I will show you the man. And my dad died completely out of the blue. He was a lecturer in chemistry, very bright man, academic, captained all Australian universities basketball team, super fit. And I'd come home from a swimming tournament, very pleased with myself because I just won a competition. And my mum said, I've got some very sad news for you. I'm afraid your dad's had a heart attack and died, which seemed pretty unlikely at 38, given he was so fit. But I had no reason to think otherwise. And I only found out much later that he'd taken his life. And in those days, in 1960s Australia, Mum, who was a teacher, had asked advice, and they said, don't tell the kids the truth until you think they're old enough to take it. And the situation never really arose. And I didn't really consider there was an alternative. I was very young when he died, and I just assumed he had had a heart attack. It might have made me go into medicine. A lot of people go into medicine because they think of stuff that has happened in their past that might have shaped them. So that's maybe one reason that I went into medicine, but it wasn't until much later I found out the truth, that it was a mental health issue rather than a...
And if I may, how many years later was it that either your mum told you...
He died in 69 and I found out in the 90s. So I was already married to Joe. I think we'd had Will. So yeah, a good 30 odd years, I guess.
So the truth did not out of
No.
of what happened for 30 years or so. Crikey.
Yeah. And
wow.
that was unusual, I guess. But it's interesting because when I reflect on it, I think, well, did it do him any harm? And interestingly, had I known that there was a strong family history of mental illness and suicide, and actually having rehearsed my family tree, I've now realized there's lots of bipolar disease and lots of men bowing out early and women being left to pick up the pieces, as I guess there is in lots of people's family trees. Would it have been helpful to me growing up to know that? And I think probably not. My brother was older and he could sort of remember something being not quite right. So my mum had genuinely thought he'd had a heart attack and only found out at the post-mortem that he'd taken his life. And my brother Steve, who was 2 years older, can remember the police coming round afterwards and remember thinking something wasn't quite right. But at 7, I didn't pick that up at all. I just got on with it and thought, gosh, that's really sad. So yes, that obviously shaped me and does still shape you. The interesting thing about suicide is that it not just casts a shadow, but it changes your life for good. You're always reflecting on what might have been, I guess. But I was extremely lucky, because the second thing, I guess, that shaped my life is my wonderful mum, who then at a fairly young age picked up all the pieces and brought us back together, and then married an extraordinary builder called Stan, who was my stepdad. So my first dad was an academic chemist and very bright, Cambridge PhD, etc. Stan was a self-made Wiltshire man, didn't go to uni, but went to building school and was just a wonderful, decent, kind man. He used to go, Phil, do what you're good at and do what you enjoy and try to be a decent man. That was the advice I remember him giving me.
Wonderful.
And he was very empathic, kind man. And so, I think, well, I lost my dad, who I didn't know very well because he was a workaholic and I was only 7, but I gained Stan, who was the most wonderful stepdad. So I don't, that's just what happens in life. Shit happens in everyone's life, and doors open and doors close, and one door closed, another door open.
And so is Stan still with us? You were talking about him in the past tense.
No, sadly, he died a few years ago. He died of pancreatic cancer. And I was very lucky to be able to help Mum nurse him at home. That was a very moving experience. And probably, yes, another one, I guess, that really shaped my life, in that another reason I went into medicine is I heard Dame Cicely Saunders, who was a founder of the hospice movement, come and speak at our school. And extraordinary. She said the joy of being human is to be humane. And she showed old videos of people dying in the hospice, but having fun. They were towards the end of life, but they would do dancing. They would laugh together. They would sing together. They would cry together. And this idea that you can get the most out of life even when you're dying, and that everyone deserves a decent death, stayed with me. So yeah, I felt very lucky to be able to give Stan a really decent death. Other things that shaped me, you'd think that medical school and becoming a doctor shaped you, but
on balance.
Probably did, but actually I think struck off and die in terms of changing my mindset. The interesting thing about medicine is that it's very regimented and it's very dictated by rules and guidelines. And the beauty of stand-up comedy is that you're entirely free. There are no rules. The only rule is you've got to make people laugh and get bums on seats. But there are no key performance indicators. You don't have to do this or that. You personally do what you find is funny, and you either ring bells with enough people to earn a living or you don't. So doing that, particularly with Tony Gardner, who was the funniest bloke I've ever shared a stage with. He gave up medicine to become a comedy actor and has been in Last Tango in Halifax and Fresh Meat and My Parents Are Aliens. So he's had a pretty successful career. But in terms of freedom and liberation, and the Edinburgh Fringe then opens the door to everything else. But I was unusual, I guess, in that a lot of comedy doctors give up the day job, and I always enjoyed both. I always joked that I carried on doing medicine because I need the material. And it is true that if you carry on working in the NHS, you'll get a never-ending load of stories. But I like doing both hand in hand. I think the jobs I do now, which is medicine, which is comedy, which is journalism, broadcasting, etc., they're all about truth-seeking and they're all about storytelling. And sometimes as a doctor, you interpret somebody else's story in a fairly scientific way, but actually you're helping them get through their lives. And sometimes you're disguising the inevitability of death. I think one of the things you learn if you lose a parent fairly early on is that we're born to die, and humans are the one species who know this well in advance, which I guess is one reason why we developed a sense of humor. So that shaped me a huge amount. I would also have to say that my marriage to Jo has shaped me a huge amount. I was, you know, when you're a young comedian and you have this exhibitionist desire to shock and you don't mind offending people, and that's what Struck Off and Die did. We got all these complaints to the Broadcasting Standards Council, and, you know, patients' heads falling off and junior doctors doing awful things and alcoholic surgeons butchering people. And they would deliberately set out to offend and shock people. And they did. God, we got buckets of complaints. And then we would read the complaints out because sometimes they were funnier than the sketches. And you can sort of do that when you're young.
Yeah.
But that sort of cruel humor, which divides people rather than unites them, is fine for a short while, but it's not a long-term strategy, or you end up quite angry and bitter. So I was very lucky to meet Jo, who actually I met through Tony, my comedy partner. She was on the same GP training scheme. And we've been together for over 30 years and married for 28 of them. And she's kept me kind, I think. I could have gone off the rails slightly without her. And even through lockdown, I can, you know, when you can just sit down with someone you've been with for a long time and watch some crappy box set and just enjoy it. I think that's a top marriage guidance counseling tip is, can you just sit on a settee next to someone and not be irritated by them? And if you can manage that, that's about as good as it gets, I think.
A great rediscovery. Oh, who's that on the sofa? And you enjoyed the same box set. I like that.
So that's obviously shaped me. And clearly your kids shape you. Being a dad is a huge thing. And again, fair play to Jo. I mean, when Jo married me, she thought my dad had died at 38 of a heart attack and there might have been a family history of premature heart disease. And then a few years into our marriage, she discovers that there's actually a family history of premature mental illness.
All those insurance policies were a mistake.
He's hung on in there. So yeah, kids have an extraordinary impact on your life. I mean, I sort of, although yes, it's changed my life, I sort of describe my parenting style as benign neglect. I mean, I think kids need... My kids are lucky in that they've, you know, been brought up in a house where we can afford food and they've got their own room and space and comfort and warmth, but they also need to be free to take risks and to make their own choices in life. And I'm very proud of them then, but it does change. You know, you never, let's say I worry about my kids, but you never stop thinking about them and the goalposts change. So that
my sole time when you talked about Stan, your stepdad, by the way, because obviously my son is called Stan after my love of Stan Laurel. So whenever I hear the word Stan, obviously it brings me back to thinking about my son, of course. It's
a good name, Stan, isn't it? In fact, Stan was a brilliant footballer. He played for Wiltshire and played at a very high level. But interesting, when his funeral came, just people came from all over the place to pay their tributes. because he'd been so kind and generous. He was brilliant with his hands, Stan, because he was a builder. So he could do dry stone walling. He could build and repair. He bought.
Was he the goalkeeper then, going with the same hands?
He was. There was a stab, but he wasn't a goalkeeper. He was a left back. He played for Burton, but he was just very good with his hands, and I wasn't. I always had the gift of the gab, and he knew that I was thinking of doing medicine. And he saw me cut a slice of bread one day with great big steps in it, and he said, "Just don't be a surgeon. Tell me one thing, Phil. Promise me you won't be a surgeon."
And by the way, that sounds like a very that does sound like a very good impression of him, even though I don't know him, because you're doing.
Yeah, he was. He was very good advice, and very brave towards the end with his pancreatic cancer. So yeah, those I guess they're the major influences on my life. My mum's still going. She's 85. She can vault over gates. She lives on her own. She's quite extraordinary. She taught me. She said the secret she thought of surviving life was to enjoy your own company. If you can enjoy your own company, you can disappear inside your head and not mind what you find there. Then even if shit is happening around you or the middle of a pandemic, you tend to cope. So
well, the comic spin on that is never go unaccompanied into a dodgy neighborhood. So in your own head, you be, it's a bit dark in there.
Yeah, I think that's true. But she's had a lot of, once mum opened up about dad's death, she then opened up about all sorts of other things. So her dad had walked out on her when she was only 3 in 1939, just before the war started, and she never saw her dad again.
Oh.
So all sorts of stuff. Her uncle shot himself and committed suicide. Her granddad committed suicide, stuck his head in the oven.
So the door opened.
All this history of men leaving her.
Yeah.
And yet she very resiliently has hung on in there and loves her garden and loves connecting with nature and loves living in the moment, but doesn't really like reflecting on the past because it's a bit dark.
And I'm hearing a constancy in you, by the way, because although she's had all that experience, you are a male role model that is a constant in her life, please.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And she's a constant in mine. I like to feel I've broken the Hammond curses as my brother, and my brother who took it harder than me when he found out the secret about dad, because he always thought that something hadn't been right and he'd had various issues.
He's older, was he?
He's 2 years older, and he's living in Australia. Mm-hmm. So half the family are over there. I mean, that's the other thing. I feel at home when I'm in Australia, even though it's too hot.
Yeah.
But
with your ginger complexion, if you don't mind me saying, you're a pale-skinned.
My burn time is about 3 minutes, but Australia is extraordinary. We have a fairly common language, but our pandemic management is the antithesis. They lock down after one case, and we happily let thousands of people die and hope it'll be okay and not too bad. I mean, it's just a bizarre, yeah. So following the science isn't easy. It depends on the culture of your country as well, I think.
Yes, and we will absolutely talk about the COVID casebooks. I know that's how various nations have played the pandemic is probably part of what you'll be talking about. So back into your tree canopy.
Oh, 3 things that inspire me. That's the next thing, isn't it? So things that inspire. I am, sounds rather trite, but I am inspired by patients. The reason I'm inspired by patients is, aside from my dad's death, very little bad has happened in my life. People have always been fairly kind to me. I've had a bit of ribbing over ginger hair and stuff over the years, but nothing unpleasant, no prolonged cruelty. I've only ever had a couple of days off sick in my entire life when I got viral meningitis when I was a lecturer in Birmingham. Never had any other time off apart from that, never wake up in pain, never been sick. And yet I see patients. I've now worked in pediatric fatigue clinics for the last few years, and I see young people with terrible symptoms they've had for many years that they bear with great humor and fortitude. And that's really the beauty of the NHS. You see people with really horrible illnesses who really do inspire you in the way that they cope. I was talking to a friend of mine who works in a hospice at the moment, and she's got this chap with a terrible condition with a cancer of his face that's basically eaten through half his face, and it's going to kill him, and he's terminally ill, and he's having palliative care in the hospice, and he is unbelievably cheerful and positive. So this chap with half a face, his brother managed to buy him a really expensive pair of Sennheiser headphones, but only one of the earphones works. So he got it for £5. But this chap, because he's only got one ear, was absolutely over the moon. And you get that all the time in medicine. You get people who terrible things have happened in their lives, and they just take it on the chin and get on with it. And the other extreme is you get people who just have a tiny little itch on the end of their nose, and they're absolutely distraught, and they're running down to the doctor every 5 minutes. So that whole variation of the human condition is fascinating. But yeah, patients who've had a terrible time and yet just keep going. It's almost like it's not as bad as reading the Auschwitz diaries, but that sort of thing. People who
Yes.
still find meaning and purpose in their life, even though it's awful, is
Yes.
incredibly inspiring. The second thing I find inspiring is kindness. I've always, not always, but I'm much kinder than I used to be. I think I was a bit angry and aggressive and keen to get noticed, but I've become a lot kinder over 20, 30 years. And I noticed that. And one of the things I liked about the pandemic were the little acts of kindness of, you know, people putting out food and pies and checking in on their neighbors and volunteering for vaccines and volunteering to help with vaccines. And that whole idea of health being a collective good as well as an individual responsibility, I thought was great. And we need to sort of harness that kindness. Yes, there's anger, there's the anti-mask, anti-lockdown, anti-everything else, and there's division. But there's a huge amount of kindness. I generally work out about 80% of people I would say were pretty decent and kind. And 20% of us could do with a bit of improvement. But yeah, those acts of kindness, always inspire me. And they sort of bring you back to
What's really telling, by the way, is you've mentioned the word, and we've reflected on the word kindness about 5 or 6 times. It really is a bit of a factory default in you, I'm noticing.
And the other thing that inspires me is really good live performance. It can be comedy. Interestingly, the funniest comedy gig I ever saw was musical comedy. So when I grew up, I used to love John Otway, who was an old singer-performer who did Call Baby, That's Really Free, and Beware of the Flowers. And he used to sing really funny versions. He used a terrible Bob Dylan, and he'd do Blockbuster by the Sweet and a really funny version of The Green, Green Grass of Home. But his shows would be very interactive and funny. And that combination of music and humor really used to hook me. And then I moved on to Loudon Wainwright III, who is Rufus and Martha's dad. And again, he would sing really brilliant, cleverly structured, funny stories with brilliant musicianship. So that combination of fantastic lyrics and storytelling and brilliant musicianship. And then the funniest gig I ever went to, I think, was a Canadian trio called Corky and the Juice Pigs. And they were up at the Edinburgh Fringe years ago, Phil Nicol and Sean Cullen, and I can't remember the name of the third bloke, but they were wonderful. And they sang a song, the famous song is called I'm the Only Gay Eskimo. But again, it was that series of really good musicianship and completely wacky Canadian musical humor. So when you're in the flow and you see something really funny, there's a wonderful Netflix special by Bo Burnham, who's an American comedian called Inside, where he was locked inside for the entire pandemic. And he's done a Netflix special, which is by turns incredibly funny and really quite sad and moving as it's affecting his mental health after a while. So that sort of thing where someone's at the head of their game and performing at the top of their game. And of course, you could apply that to the Olympics or any other sport. When you see someone performing at the top of their game, I do find that really inspiring.
Sort of the joy of the immersion of excellence in all its forms.
But also, I like that, but I also have to say that good enough is okay. So you can be an excellent comedian, but a good enough cook. So just because you can't be excellent at everything, the nice thing about being mediocre at, for example, cooking, is that you can serve up something that's really mediocre and nobody's disappointed because they know you're fairly mediocre. It's like being a mediocre trumpeter or a mediocre singer. There are lots of things I do with a lot of mediocrity that I enjoy. So
earlier on, it was very relatable when you said you're famous, obviously, for the gift of the gab, but not so good with your hands. I'm a complete DIY turnip. So similarly, I relate.
Well, Jeremy Hardy, who I loved and is sadly no longer with us, always used to describe it as scabbing. He said, if you're taking work off somebody who should be doing that DIY job far better than you are, A, it'll be worse, and B, you're taking food out of their children's mouths. So he called me a scab for doing DIY. So I've never forgotten that.
Good point.
He had a lovely gag. He said, I try to live every day as if it was my last, lying in my bed, drifting in and out of consciousness and dribbling. That's probably how our last day is going to be. So yeah, I miss him. Lots of comedians die young, but he and Linda Smith were two that I particularly miss. So that's it. What am I doing? Oh, other things is that the 3? Have I done the? Oh yes, I've done kindness.
I believe
excellent.
You do the math. I think we're there. This is
2
lovely.
things that never fail to grab my attention.
You're a consummate professional. You know what you're doing.
Well, disco. Anyone put disco on, I'm there. I'm focused. So disco always goes, and my dogs. So dogs will look at you until you take them out for a walk, and they do get my attention. But I would also say live performance when you're pushed down in front of a microphone and it's live. But I also count consultations as that. There's not it's to say that a consultation is a performance is slightly trite, because you have to have the values of compassion and kindness. You know, consulting in medicine can't just be how to win friends and influence people. In fact, previously, before I landed in Bristol, where I met you, I taught communication skills in Bath. In Birmingham. And there was a big debate about whether we should run a course called Acting Skills for Doctors. And this idea is that doctors are often knackered and tired, and they really don't want to get out of bed and treat you, but they have to. So can they put on a show to pretend they care a little more than they do? And we decided that that wasn't authentic, and actually we should have.
Although Rudy Shelley, the acting teacher at the Old Vic, used to talk about when your presence is required to turn up and do your job, he would say, Ducky, and there's an expletive, so I'll blank it out. Ducky, nobody gives a fuck how you feel. In other words, when it's time to turn up, no one cares how you feel. You've just got to do it.
You've got to do it. So I do. I also, it never fails to get my attention when I'm doing consultations. And interestingly, over the last year or so, I've had to switch entirely from face-to-face consultations to Zoom consultations. So we decided in pediatric fatigue that we didn't want kids to come to hospital or put them at risk of getting COVID.
Yeah.
When you've got post-viral fatigue or long COVID, you don't really want to travel all the way to a hospital, find somewhere to park and get out. So we do it all via Zoom now.
Yeah.
And you've got to go that extra mile to grab attention and pick up non-verbal cues, et cetera, when you're doing a Zoom consultation as opposed to a live one. There are little nuances you don't get, but you get the extra benefit of seeing the family background, seeing the dogs in the background, seeing the other kids running to and fro, and there are other things that you pick up. So yeah, when I'm on it, as in expected to perform as a comedian or a broadcaster or a doctor, that I do actually concentrate quite hard, and then often have a lie down afterwards.
Yes, because it is a scorch of one's adrenaline to be there in the spotlight. And by the way, thank you for being, I don't know if you knew this, but you're actually my first Facebook Live guinea pig today. But when I asked you the question, happy with yes, happy with no, I was just really happy that obviously we both respond to the fact that when it's time to go live, it just adds a different frisson. Which it
does. So one quirky or unusual fact you don't know about me. I think we're onto that now?
We are.
Yes, when I was 16, I fell asleep with a penis enlarger on. Not a lot of people know that, but I was doing a paper round at the age of about 14 to 16. And the bloke at 16 Barlow Close always used to get Fiesta magazine, which was a gentleman's magazine before the internet that I used to read as a young man before I'd stick it through his door. And I had ginger hair and freckles.
What are you sticking through his door? The magazine?
The magazine I'd stick through the door,
Sorry,
the
just
Fiesta.
to be clear.
And I had ginger hair and freckles and some National Health spectacles that looked like a sea slug had fallen asleep on my eyebrows. Whereas my brother Steve was blonde, bronzed Adonis, and had all the girlfriends. Right. Anyway, I was leafing through Fiesta magazine, and at the back of the magazine, it said, would you like to have a penis that is substantially longer and thicker? I think he was guaranteeing 3 inches in length and whatever, 2.5 inches in girth. And it would have cost me about 5 weeks of paper round money. It wasn't cheap, but I thought this is what you need to do to get a girlfriend. It's only 16, so I send this off and it arrives in a brown paper bag with a series of instructions that you're supposed to do. And then this thing, which is a bit like, you know, with erectile dysfunction, you can either have Viagra or you can put a pump on. And in this thing, you had to put a pump on and put a little ring on the bottom to tighten everything up. And obviously, my brother was always coming to my room, so I couldn't do this, you know, halfway through the evening when I was doing my homework in case somebody disturbed me. It would be too embarrassing for that. So I used to pop it on at night. It said half an hour maximum. Otherwise, things could clot off. And anyway, I put it on one night, fell asleep. And I woke up the next morning and yeah, my penis was enormous and black. Be careful what you wish for.
Yes.
And I took the ring off and I let everything down and managed to get away from it. And then
have
my
we retained the colour scheme, or are we different now?
Eh?
Have we retained the colour scheme, or we now return to normal?
No, we're all fine now. It's all. But my lovely brother, because I then put it in my school satchel. I thought, I've had enough of this. This is dangerous. So I hid it in my school satchel, and my brother found it. And he said, "What's this?" And I said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, it's a penis enlarger, isn't it?" And I said, and he said, "Phil," he said, "you don't need a huge penis to be a nice bloke, decent bloke. What girls want is attention and kindness." And he took out the enlarger and he put earth in it and planted a sunflower in it. And he said, "Pay attention to the sunflower, because that's what you need to be successful in relationships, is simply to pay attention." And that was a very good lesson for me, because I've learned the secret of communication skills, as you know, is to pay attention to what the other person is saying and then show that you've paid attention. I
like your brother. I love that. So
he's now a real guru, and he lives in Australia and he works with Aboriginal communities and he sings folk songs. And so, yes, he's also been a very significant influence in my life. He's very laid back and clever. But
And
yes,
what's his name? Did you say that already?
Steve.
Steve.
And Steve has a daughter called Kaya, who has married the Outback Wrangler, who's like Australian's replacement for Crocodile D and Steve Irwin. He wrangles crocodiles up in Darwin.
As you do.
So I've got this massive ochre Australian presence. I haven't told him the story about the penis enlarger because he would probably roar with laughter. So that's not one for the Australian relatives, but I doubt many of them are tuning into this.
Well, they might, because this goes global, apparently.
Well, there you are. Who knows?
But I love that. So the penis enlarger ends up with dirt and a
sunflower. Yeah, that's the thing. If you've still got an unused penis enlarger at home, I recommend you turn it upside down, fill it with a good quality topsoil, and put a sunflower in there, or a geranium.
DM me for more gardening tips. I love that. That's fantastic. Lovely. So now it's brilliant. We've shaken your tree, and a beautiful canapé shake that was. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Now we move away from the tree and we stay in the clearing, and we're going to talk about alchemy and gold now. You've been giving me this by the bucket load anyway because of the defaulting to you're being a big fan of kindness and self-care that you've been promoting all along the way. But when you are at purpose and in flow, Mr. Prolific Pants, Dr. Phil Hammond, what are you most happy doing or bringing to the world?
I like using the creative side of my brain. And I think the sadness, I think, for many doctors is they do this fairly regimented job where you follow various diagnostic pathways and don't use the creative side of their brain as much. So I think the reason I've carried on doing several careers is to allow me to do that. So there's nothing better than crafting a new joke. You're not sure whether it's going to work, trying it out for the first time, and it works. I mean, that's a beauty. I have to say, I've got friends who do research or they design vaccines and things, and they are amazing because you've got to work bloody hard, make loads of mistakes. It takes years and years and years and years, and eventually you get there. I'm a bit into instant gratification. That may be just the way I am. It may be because I was always worried I might die at 38 like my dad, so better get things over quickly. So crafting a new gag and trying it out. I love the discipline of writing a column for, say, Private Eye, and I've got a certain number of words. And every man and his dog's writing about the pandemic. So what can I suddenly squeeze in my column this week that's going to keep people interested? And that's probably been my big contribution this year, actually, is that I learned fairly early on that no single expert has the answer. So you have to listen to lots of expertise and try and put it all together in a way that's fairly broad and balanced and not overtly blamey. And so I've been really proud of those. And when I'm in the flow of writing and it's going well, I absolutely love that because you suddenly, it's almost like a knight's move in chess. You get an idea and you think, oh, I can go that way there and I can go that way, then I can go there. And then I've got to bring it all back together again.
And by the way, that's a lovely segue into Enter Dr. Hammond's COVID Casebook. That's the book you've just written for Private Eye, isn't it?
I have. Well, I've got two things coming up in August. I've got this casebook, which, as I say, I don't think it's all entirely correct. It's full of doubt and error and uncertainty, but that's what science is. You know, people keep saying following the science. If you have established science, we generally know what to do in a heart attack because they've been around for a while now. So you're aiming to do the right thing right first time if you can. There's a golden hour between chest pain and getting people treatment, etc. If it's a new virus that you've never seen before in a pandemic, there isn't necessarily an evidence-based manual to follow. There's no evidence base for lockdowns. Research into masks actually is full of holes. We haven't done a huge amount of research. And so you're slightly winging it and making it up and forming a hypothesis and testing it and seeing if it works. And that inevitably involves error. If you're not making errors, you're not admitting errors and not learning from errors, you're not doing science. And yet politics doesn't allow you to do that. All mature safety industries allow you to put your hand up and say, I've made a mistake, or put your hand up and say, we're about to make a mistake. And that's absolutely critical. But politics hates that. Politics hates admissions of guilt. We kick things into the long grass and have public inquiries that take 10 years to learn the lessons of something that happened we need to know the answers to now.
So my assumption would be that the COVID casebook, over the 18 months it was being done in real time, it's probably got an arc of truth to it, hasn't it? There must be a through line to it.
Yes, I mean, it's basically fortnightly reports from the front line. So it's written in real time. This is what I think at this particular point in time.
Lovely.
And there've been a few hits and misses, but I mean, the biggest miss, I guess, is I didn't think there would be a pandemic to begin with. I thought we'd deal with it in the same way as we dealt with SARS in 2003, which was to isolate and break chains of transmission to stop it spreading before it happened. And it was only when we realized that this little bugger could spread without symptoms. That was the thing that really did us.
Yeah.
You know, SARS in 2003 generally had really unpleasant symptoms fairly early on when you were infectious. So you could think, oh my God, that bloke's got SARS. let's isolate. It was dangerous for doctors. A few doctors and nurses died treating patients with SARS, but because we could spot them fairly quickly, we could break the chains.
Yeah.
The reason this virus was so hard is that so much transmission occurred without symptoms. It had a long incubation period.
Yeah.
Some people didn't get symptoms at all. Some people only got minor symptoms. It spread through droplets up close and then hung around in the air. And it meant that there were loads of people coming back from skiing holidays in February half term onwards when it started, spitting billions of virus particles all over other people, but not realizing they were infectious.
Yes.
So all of a sudden we locked down. All of a sudden we said, let's use face masks.
Yes.
But because there hadn't been a randomized controlled trial, people were saying, oh, should we be doing this? And it taught you actually you had to take action ahead of the science. You can, in a new pandemic, you can't suddenly wait for the science to appear because you'll be too late.
So in the sort of book circuit that you're on, do you know people like Michael Rosen because of his extraordinary experience?
Yeah, I've met COVID? Michael. Yeah. I mean, that's, yes, his story. I mean, all those stories written by people who suffered from COVID and hideous long COVID. I mean, they're all important and need to be heard, which is why we do need a public inquiry. It needs to hear all those voices because they all matter. And of course, people harmed by lockdown. You can't just say that, any intervention causes harms as well as benefits. And lots of people have been harmed by social isolation, lockdown, lack of education. We need to be mature about this. And I think what will happen at the end of the day, just as the perfect health service is probably a conglomeration of bits of health services in lots of different countries, the perfect COVID response is probably a conglomeration of lots of different things. So if we could have had the sort of the Australian and New Zealand and South Asian response early on to clamping down on the virus, plus our own early vaccination, those two things together probably would have saved far more lives than other countries. So getting vaccines to the people who need it most is the next big challenge, I guess.
So again, we'll mention the COVID casebook overtly at the very end. It's my job just to get us to crack along the curation of the journey towards a 45-minute programme. So now we're going to award you with a cake, Dr. Phil Hammond. So what type of cake would you like before I describe the cherry you should apply to it?
Now, I do like a good old banana cake. I know there's been a lot of banana cakes made over lockdown, but I just because you always buy too many bananas and they all go a bit mushy.
Do you make them yourself as well then?
Well, my lovely wife Jo generally makes them. I have dabbled with a banana cake.
I do like a banana cake. I like.
She'd be the main curator of banana cakes, Shay Hammond, I would say. So Joanna, give Joanna a thumbs up for that one.
So I'm going to invite you now to put a cherry on your cake, and this is the final storytelling metaphor of a deliberately multi-layered cake, although we're slightly time-bound by the idea that I'd like you to share stuff like the favourite bit of advice you've ever been given, what's the best leadership quote or some quote that's always given you succor and pulled you towards your future, and it can include just a quick statement on what advice you might proffer to a younger version of yourself. And then finally, inspired by a cheeky bit of Shakespeare, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. Legacy, when all is said and done, Dr. Phil Hammond, how would you most like to be remembered?
That's a lot to say, isn't it? You really throw it in there, don't you?
Cram it in, Gov.
I've already mentioned Stan was a big issue in that do what you're good at, do what you enjoy, and try to be a decent man. That was really useful advice.
Thank you for
growing up.
That was lovely.
My old GP trainer, Brian, who was a Yorkshireman, he used to go, life is a pool of shit, and our job is to direct people to the shallow end. And I think all services do that, try and direct people to the shallow. In fact, the British Medical Association, I used to do that gag, and someone from the British Medical Association said, we've got a sign up in the BMA house that says shit happens, but we can adjust the level. And then it says up or down. So sometimes you can make things worse. So I think this idea that
that's COVID management, right?
Eventually, shit happens to us all eventually. But, in our 70, 80, 90 years on this planet, there are going to be periods when life is great and when it's boring and when it really falls to pieces. And yet you have the resilience to cope with that. I think in terms of health over a lifetime, I remember a very wise relationship counselor saying to me, actually, at the end of the day, what keeps you healthy over a lifetime is the quality of your relationships. We're all going to get sick at some stage. We're all going to have to face illness or disease, but people who have and invest time in really nurturing relationships over the course of a lifetime are the ones who survive. You don't need loads of them. You don't have to have hundreds of them, but there's sort of maybe half a dozen nurturing relationships. So that's a bit of gold that I would give you. I've always struggled to take life seriously, and I don't know whether that's just me, but my reference from St. Thomas's, which is lovely, that my medical school was quite posh. So I went half to Cambridge and half to St Thomas's, which was like the old rugged public school one opposite the Houses of Parliament. And they were terribly serious. And I used to get the giggles on ward rounds, and I used to be told off for laughing all the time. Anyway, when you came to apply for a house job, you had to put a tiny passport photo up in the consultant's dining room and they could choose you. And just for a laugh, I put a massive 10x8 comedy color photo of me and didn't get chosen for a house job. And then kept going for all these house jobs. And I turn up, and this chap eventually said, a chap in Bath, he said, you interviewed really well, Phil, but do you want me to read your reference from St Thomas's? And it said, this student refuses to take medicine seriously. He does not deserve a house job. So it's trying in life to get the balance between serious and not being serious. Clearly, medicine is serious. If you cut the wrong leg off or you give the wrong drug, that's very serious. But there must be a place for frivolity and hope and fun in medicine. And this is another plug, but I've just got a radio series coming out on Radio 4 starting on August the 26th called Dr Phil's Bedside Manner. And the idea of this is we were going around the NHS trying to cheer up the staff. We went to 4 different hospitals and I collected, like a big ginger magpie, I collected their best stories. And then I did a free comedy show for them. But part of it was this idea, has working in healthcare become less fun? Do we now take it far too seriously? Can you still laugh in a pandemic? And we got some absolutely brilliant stories from frontline workers. So humor is alive and kicking. It's okay to laugh. Yes. It's the best medicine, unless you have syphilis, in which case it's penicillin. But generally, laughter and penicillin and vaccination, all worth having. So yeah, don't be afraid to laugh, I think. It's an essential coping mechanism. And there are lots of people who make a living out of laughter therapy and tell you how it improves your lung function and your mood and your pheromones and your fertility.
And by the way, at the beginning of the pandemic, I found the most beautiful quote about that, which is, we have to laugh because laughter, as we already know, is the first evidence of freedom.
Yes, I think that's true. It is very liberating, and the practice of it is very liberating. And actually, when you make a room full of people laugh, that's extraordinarily liberating. And I've probably done as much use making people laugh as I have trying to cure them, I guess, over the years. So, yeah, laughter is the best medicine is my last and final piece of advice.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to the delight that is Dr. Phil Hammond. This has been Your Life and Times with me, Chris Grimes. Anything else you'd like to say? You can plug whatever you'd like, URLs, that sort of thing. We've got about 30 seconds.
No, actually, I'm delighted. Well, obviously, come and see me if I go on tour again. I might go to Edinburgh next year. I quite fancy Comedy for Carers or Dr. Phil's COVID cluster pop. Might be in there. Who knows? There'll be something going. So just look out for Dr. Phil.
And your website personally is?
It's drphilhammond.com, but it hasn't seen much action recently. I'm fairly active on Twitter.
Yes.
I've got 100-odd thousand Twitter followers. No idea who they are, but I don't do anger on Twitter and I don't do hate. I don't block people. I just don't listen to you if you get angry.
And coming full circle, that's because you're a big fan of kindness and self-care. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Until next week, for more Stories in the Clearing, to your good health, Dr. Phil Hammond, I've been Chris Grimes. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.